Hello, everyone. My name is Dick Furstein, and tonight I'm going to talk to you a little bit about monuments in Philadelphia. Um, as some of you know, I am a board member here at APT, and I became interested in this topic pretty recently when it became a national and international question of what should we do with the monuments that we have? How can we best work to preserve them? But also, how can we adjust ourselves to the reality that the monuments no longer mean what we used to think they meant? So without further ado, I'm going to start sharing my screen and we'll get started. All right. Great. All right. Can everyone see that?
Yeah, we can see it, Dick.
Perfect. All right. So, monuments in public space, a history of Philadelphia statuary. And we can see here what was the base of the Columbus Monument, which has been boarded up and covered with a chalkboard with the prompt, "What are your hopes for the future of Philadelphia?" So, what do a 15th century Genovese sailor and a 1970s Philadelphia mayor have in common? Here's my slideshow froze on the first slide. One more time. Okay. So what do a 15th century Genovese sailor and a 1970s Philadelphia mayor have in common? In the case of Cristoforo Colombo and Francis Lazaro Rizzo Sr., quite a lot. Both were considered heroes to the Italian-American community of South Philadelphia. Both led lives shrouded in controversy, and until this past month, both had monuments dedicated to them in Philadelphia. Today, we are going to talk about monuments in public space, what they are, what functions they serve, and who they represent in our society. My goal during this talk is not to introduce you to all 1,500 monuments in Philadelphia. It's to explore why monuments exist and how our relationships with them have evolved.
Can you put the microphone a little bit over? You're breaking up like crazy. Thank you.
Mhm. All right. Let's see. Well, it's to challenge what you think when you see one and examine the impact they have on contemporary life. Typically, when we hear the term monument, we think of something big and gray or black, stone or metal, or both. Monuments are things that we make, right? Well, not always. Our conversation about monuments in Philadelphia will begin with the first people to live in this part of the world, the Lenape Native Americans. From there, we will look at monuments from the Revolutionary period, from the Civil War and the Centennial, and the Bicentennial. Along the way, I will highlight 4 neighborhoods in Philadelphia with rich monumental legacies, starting with the Native American village of Shakamaxon, the Old City neighborhood, Center City, and Fairmount Park. But let's start at the beginning. The Lenape, or genuine people in their language, inhabited an area known to them as Lenapehoking. Lenapehoking was vast and varied, stretching from the coastal plains of South Jersey and the Delaware Valley up through present-day New York and Connecticut. According to River Chronicles, the Journal of Philadelphia Waterfront Heritage and Archaeology, archaeological evidence of Lenape settlements confirmed that they and their ancestors lived in the Delaware Valley for at least 12,000 years, probably arriving here at the end of the last ice age. Evidence suggests that Lenape's relatives lived in the area around Pittsburgh for at least 16,000 years. The local Lenape spoke Unami, an Algonquin language that marks many of our contemporary place names. They gathered in female-centered communities, and they migrated seasonally. Today, the Lenape are represented federally by the Delaware Nation and the Delaware tribes, both in Oklahoma, and the Stockbridge-Muncie community in Wisconsin. A smaller group fled to Canada after the American Revolution. For the Lenape, this land was a piece of Turtle Island created specifically for them to live on, stocked with the food and the resources they needed to flourish. And while all of Turtle Island is sacred, the specific local topology of our area was incredibly important to the Lenape people's sense of place. Archaeological research has found no evidence of stone or metal statues that we would recognize, but the Lenape landscape was dominated by monuments. Delving specifically into the area that would become Philadelphia, Lenape people tended to live along the Delaware and Schuylkill rivers. They called the Delaware the Makarakitan, the Great Tidal River, and they observed the way it connected them with the Atlantic Ocean and northern parts of Lenapehoking. Today, a substantial part of Lenape's Delaware has been replaced by a more familiar means of transportation, Interstate Highway 76. Filling in the foreshore was seen as crucial to building a modern Philadelphia and has radically changed the environment that William Penn would have known. On the other side of Philadelphia is the Schuylkill. It has many names in Unami, including Manayunk, or place where we drink, and provided a sheltered area to camp and fish. We can see it here from the Strawberry Mansion Bridge in the middle of Fairmount Park. One of its main tributaries, the Wissahickon, or Catfish Creek, was so named for the plentiful fish that it had stocked in it. In what is now the northern part of Philadelphia, a third creek, the Aramingo, which means wolf squawk, flowed into the Delaware. Europeans would attest to seeing wolves there as late as the 1700s. We can see here a file photo of the Aramingo Canal before it was turned into a combined sewer. But are these monuments? While Europeans regarded them as features to overcome in building a larger city, Lenape named and honored their topology as a part of the divine tapestry in which their lives were woven. The first Europeans to arrive here did not agree, but their descendants would begin to change their minds as they settled the American West. In 1906, Congress would pass the Antiquities Act, allowing President Teddy Roosevelt to declare large areas as historic or scientific interest and call them national monuments. This would quickly lead to the creation of the Grand Canyon National Monument in Arizona, which we can see Teddy Roosevelt surveying here. On the state level, Pennsylvania's Scenic Rivers Act of 1982 would offer protection for undeveloped flowing bodies of water, like the Schuylkill River here in Philadelphia. While our current discourse on monuments focuses on the preservation or the destruction of the likenessness of historical figures, we must remember that our views are not the only one. The preservation of natural features is as sacred to the Delaware tribes now as it was to the Lenape in the 17th century. The most notable Lenape monument was the Great Elm at Shakamaxon, a village along the Delaware where William Penn, founder of the colony of Pennsylvania, ratified a treaty with Chief Tamanend of the Turtle Clan, seen here in Benjamin West's 1772 painting. The location of that elm is the present-day Penn Treaty Park, which is dotted with more contemporary displays of European statuary. On my recent trip to the park, I noticed a number of street signs reminding us of the significance of this neighborhood. The road running along the river, today called Delaware, which, like the river, the bay, and the state, honors the governor of Virginia, the Baron Delaware, and Columbus, for the aforementioned Christopher Colombo. Names like Penn, Shakamaxon, and Aramingo also appear nearby. After the ratification of Penn's treaty in 1682, The Shakamaxon elm stood for about 130 years before it was blown over in a storm. This print from Birch's Views of Philadelphia shows us what the park would have looked like in about 1800 with the elm still present. In 1827, a civic organization erected this obelisk on the site of the elm. However, disputes over the elm's true location raged on, and the city opted to declare the whole area a park to protect the treaty's legacy. Here is a view of the park today with one of the elm's descendants. While Penn's obelisk is not the oldest statue in Philadelphia, it is one of the more indicative of the period. European capital cities in the 18th century were full of life-size monuments to kings and noblemen, but American revolutionaries took a dim view on statues. They required costly materials and specially trained workers, both in short supply in the 13 colonies. Some of the most famous symbols of the American Revolution, like the Liberty Bell, were British imports. In the second episode of the Washington Post presidential podcast, architecture critic Philip Kennicott also tells us that George Washington was particularly concerned that monuments to future historical figures could begin to foster a cult of personality around them. For Washington and his contemporaries, monuments to people, like royal faces on currency, were echoes of tyrannical rule. This concern notwithstanding, Washington would pose for Sculptor to the Stars, Jean-Antoine Houdon, in 1785. Houdon had already sculpted big names like Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Voltaire, Molière, and American Minister to France, Benjamin Franklin, who personally invited him to the U.S. with the task of preserving Washington's likeness for a statue in the Virginia Capitol. A cast of that statue is today on display in Washington Square Park. Despite societal concerns about statuary, Benjamin Franklin posed for the oldest public monument in Philadelphia. Carved in 1789 by Francesco Lazzarini, Franklin was depicted as the original librarian to adorn the library company in 1792. We can see here a replica of that statue sitting in the facade of the library company across the street from Independence Hall, as well as the original. The replica highlights the intricacy of Lazzarini's work, combining Franklin's known connection to writing with his disavowal of the British crown. Obscured behind glass and very weathered, Franklin's original likeness is credited as being the oldest statue in Philadelphia on public display. However, since its relocation to the library company at 13th Street and Locust, it is now partially hidden behind a glass window. Currently, that window bears the names of 20 Susquehannock tribal members who were murdered during the Conestoga Massacre of 1763. The library company is promoting Ghost River, The Fall and Rise of the Conestoga, a graphic novel that reconstructs the massacre from the victim's perspective. The other monument claimed to be the oldest in Philadelphia is the statue of William Penn. Initially made in 1774 and sculpted in lead, it was intended to decorate the roof of an aristocratic home in England. After the home was torn down, the statue was sold to a junk shop in London, where William Penn's grandson and Pennsylvania proprietor, John Penn, purchased it after the American Revolution. As a show of friendship to his former property, Penn donated the statue in 1804 to be displayed at Pennsylvania Hospital, the nation's oldest. It is still on display there on Pine Street. Because it was designed to sit on a roof, the statue looks downward and would go on to inspire a much larger Penn monument installed around 90 years later. Beyond these few statues, Philadelphia doesn't really develop a monument culture until the mid-1860s. This has a lot to do with the concept of public space. As a small, densely populated city, land for public monuments was at a premium, while land for country mansions was relatively easy to obtain. With the consolidation of the city and county of Philadelphia in 1854, the city government began to look beyond the urban grid in search of new spaces. And a year later, it purchased the Lemon Hill Mansion along the Schuylkill River to make it a public common. Shortly after the conclusion of the Civil War, An act of the Pennsylvania legislature would consolidate a large area around that mansion to become a public park for the health and enjoyment of the people of Philadelphia and the preservation of the purity of the city's water supply. We can see in this map dated April of 1868, laying out the modern boundaries of that park. Within 5 years, the Commonwealth would charter the Fairmount Park Art Association to help ensure that Philadelphia was ready to host the first centennial celebration. Fairmount Park Art Association, which is now the Association for Public Art, was the first private, nonprofit civic organization in the country established to organize and raise funds for art. By connecting monument commissions to private donations, it would revolutionize the way monuments were designed and funded in the modern United States. While Fairmount Park would foster a new location for public monuments, the Civil War and rapid technological innovation would generate a new urgency. In 1862, a New York gallerist named Matthew Brady displayed a series of photographs called The Dead of Antietam, a brutal look at one of the Civil War's bloodiest battles. We can see this illustration of Brady's gallery as it appeared in Frank Leslie's illustrated newspaper in January of 1861. The emergence of photography galleries like Brady's made the war personal and generated a swell of financial support for monuments when the fighting concluded. Simultaneously, the Industrial Revolution made stone and metalworking cheaper than ever before, leading to a surge in monument creation. The first monument to benefit from this change is the one we see here, dedicated to Abraham Lincoln. Only a month after his assassination, it was commissioned, and it was completed in 1871, with 50,000 people turning out for its unveiling. Philadelphians were deeply affected by the Civil War and would continue to install sculptures to it for 50 years. 4 days after the death of President Ulysses S. Grant, another commission was formed to construct this statue, located on Kelly Drive near Fountain Green. The sculptor, Daniel Chester French, would go on to become famous for his seated Abraham Lincoln in the Lincoln Memorial on the National Mall. Before he did, though, he would collaborate with 12 other artists in Philadelphia to construct the crown jewel of Philadelphia's Civil War monuments, the Smith Memorial Arch. Forming the entrance to the Avenue of the Republic in West Fairmount Park, it would take 13 artists and 15 years to finally complete in 1912. In addition to the Civil War, Philadelphia's role as the host to the Centennial Exposition between May and October of 1876 would push the city to its artistic limits, offering America the chance to create a singular narrative about the last 100 years of history. Monuments of this era tended to reflect on the broader philosophical themes of modern society, like progress, tradition, and unity. Memorial Hall, pictured here, was built specifically to host the centennial on the Avenue of the Republic, and was meant to capture the elegance of the Beaux-Arts movement. Flanking the building's entrance are 2 Pegasus monuments. Originally made in Vienna in 1863 for the new Imperial Opera House, they were too big for the building, and the Austrian government sold them to the US. While they appear solid, they were made by clumsily bolting together multiple pieces of metal without an interior structure. In 2015, they were completely rebuilt from the inside so they didn't collapse. Another monument, originally placed in Fairmount Park and today located at 5th and Market Streets, is the Religious Liberty statue. The statue was dedicated at the end of the Centennial Exposition on Thanksgiving Day and sponsored by the oldest Jewish organization in the United States, the Order B'nai B'rith. The sculptor, Sir Moses Jacob Ezekiel, was a Virginian-born Jewish man who had fought for the Confederacy during the Civil War. While his sculpture appeals to the unifying theme of religious liberty, his personal life story and decision to leave the United States for Europe reminds us that not everyone who believes in liberty for everyone. Of the many monuments unveiled during the centennial, none have left as enduring a stain as the sculpture of Christopher Columbus. Seen here, the sculpture is attributed to Italian sculptor Emanuele Caroni and funded by the Italian colony of Philadelphia. It is believed to be the earliest public monument to Christopher Columbus in the United States. Between 1868 and 1920, Italians who lived in the colony in present-day South Philadelphia would make an annual 6-mile trek to the statue in Fairmount Park on October the 12th. In addition to thematic monuments, falling costs of materials also gave Philadelphians a chance to recreate some of their history in bronze. The most obvious example of this is the George Washington Monument, seen here. It was planned by the Society of the Cincinnati, for which the city in southwestern Ohio is named, a group of descendants of Revolutionary War veterans. While the monument was proposed in 1810, it was not until 1881 that planning began, and it wasn't installed in Fairmount Park until 1897. In 1928, the monument was moved to its current location at the Eakins Oval, forming the end of the Benjamin Franklin Parkway, as we can see here. At the other end of the parkway is Philadelphia's City Hall, itself a monument to the urban renewal that was taking place in the city. With construction starting in 1871, the masonry structure that sits at the intersection of Market and Broad Streets is covered in over 250 carved statues by Alexander Milne Calder. The most important monument within a monument is the William Penn statue, standing atop City Hall's tower. Here's an archival photo of the William Penn statue before it was assembled on top. At 37 feet tall and weighing nearly 53,000 pounds, Penn would become the architectural weight above which other buildings could not climb. An unwritten rule held that no structure could rise taller than Penn's 548-foot hat. Looking slightly downward, like the lead pen at Pennsylvania Hospital, this pen points northeast towards the Penn Treaty Park and the village of Shakamaxon, in perpetual memory of his greatest achievement. In addition to Penn himself, City Hall's facade features a number of surprising details, like the face of Benjamin Franklin staring down at pedestrians entering from the East Market Street. Alexander Milne Calder dedicated each of the 4 facades to a different ethnic group and used both caryatids, or columns decorated to be like women, and telemens, columns decorated to be like men, to honor Philadelphia's supposed commitment to gender and ethnic harmony. At the northern entrance to City Hall, we can also see 2 horsemen guarding the gate. Major General John Fulton Reynolds was a Union soldier killed by a Confederate sharpshooter at the Battle of Gettysburg. His statue would be one of the first added to the new City Hall traffic island in 1884. A decade later, the Grand Army of the Republic would commission its first statue, a monument to Philadelphia native General George McClellan. Just north of City Hall on Broad Street, we find another monument to Philadelphia's homegrown arts culture, the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts. Founded around 1805, the building seen here was completed for the centennial and designed by the famous Philadelphia architect Frank Furness. In 2011, the adjoining section of Cherry Street was redesignated as Lenfest Plaza and gifted with Claes Oldenburg's monumental paint torch, which we can see on the right. In addition to new monuments encouraged by war, this period of Philadelphia history is also when we start seeing casts of monuments rendered in bronze. Here again, we see Houdon's Washington in Washington Square. While the original was sculpted in Washington's lifetime, around 1785, for Richmond, Philadelphia's cast was not installed until 1922. Monument casting increased the prevalence of more popular art, like this sculpture entitled The Wrestlers, near the Horticultural Center in West Fairmount Park. We can see the original relic of unknown authorship at the Uffizi in Florence. The Rodin Museum on the Benjamin Franklin Parkway and its iconic thinker are other beneficiaries of this industrial approach to monument design. Both the building and its contents are imports from Europe's early 20th century. While European culture dominates Philadelphia, the Fairmount Park Art Association wanted some Native representation as well. Native Americans often appeared as background elements in wider motifs, like this reclining native at the Washington Monument in Eakins Oval. But a lack of Native subjects living in Europe or Eastern United States meant that artists struggled to properly depict them. One of the association's early commissions from 1887 was called The Stone Age in America, seen here in East Fairmount Park. The monument is both revolutionary and regressive, featuring an indigenous woman of unclear tribal affiliation with her child and a hunted bear cub. Although the sculpture renders the woman as authentically human, it leans heavily on the trope of Native American savagery because they fit into Thompson's Stone Age. In reality, Thompson's three-age system is not used to classify or describe culture, but merely to organize objects in a museum collection. Like many Native sculptures of the time, the woman stands in a traditionally European statuary pose, further reproducing the artist's bias. We can contrast Stone Age to Cyrus Dallin's famous Medicine Man, found further north in the park near 33rd and Dauphin. Medicine Man was produced just 12 years later and unveiled in Philadelphia in 1900. Cyrus Dallin grew up on the frontier and had regular peaceful interactions with members of the Crow tribe. As an art student in Paris, Dallin brought his personal experience to bear on his art, creating sculptures of Native people that presented them in the present day. Dallin also chose to sculpt his subjects as they dressed, instead of covering their skin to meet Victorian sensibilities. Medicine Man's exposed skin contrasts with his animal horns to remind us that the human and the divine are not mutually exclusive in the Crow worldview. As we move into the 20th century, Philadelphia's urban and environmental axes begin to align under the City Beautiful movement. With the growing popularity of Fairmount Park and the modernization of the municipal water system, Philadelphia's urban planners laid out an ambitious project, the Benjamin Franklin Parkway. Here, we can see Windrum's 1892 proposal for the parkway's route, slightly different than the modern iteration. When completed in 1918, the diagonal road would connect City Hall with the present-day Art Museum, gateway to Fairmount Park. Here, we can see the inspiration for the Benjamin Franklin Parkway, the Champs-Élysées, or Avenue of the Elysian Fields, in Paris. Let's compare that to what we have in Philadelphia. Here, we can see the Civil War Soldiers and Sailors Monument near 20th Street and the Parkway. Built during World War I to honor Civil War veterans, the pylons are inscribed with the phrase, "In giving freedom to the slave, we assure freedom to the free." Much like City Hall, we see the idea of freedom as a unifying concept, despite the racial disparities of post-war America. Around Logan Circle, we find other holdovers of Civil War nostalgia. The General Galusha Pennypacker Memorial, finished in 1934, commemorates a 22-year-old Chester County native who became the Union's youngest general. Pennypacker's memorial evokes the grandeur of Roman statues of the past and substitutes an image of the general for a more familiar archetype. In front of Franklin Institute, we're greeted with a very different kind of memorial. The All Wars Memorial to colored soldiers and sailors was also made in 1934, spearheaded by an African-American state legislator named Samuel Beecher Hart. Captain Hart was the last captain of the Gray Invincibles, Pennsylvania's last segregated militia unit. With the coming integration of the armed forces, Captain Hart wanted to remember the African Americans who fought in the Civil War, the Spanish-American War, the Philippines Insurrection, and World War I in segregated units. However, after the memorial was completed, it was promptly hidden from view in a remote area of Fairmount Park. It would take 60 years before the memorial was finally installed on the parkway in 1994. After World War II, Philadelphia's public art took a decidedly softer turn, shifting from images of war to more peaceful themes. This statue, called The Great Mother, is part of a set originally intended for a juvenile detention facility in Fairmount Park. Drawing on the theme of the nurturing and restorative roles of justice, the larger-than-life monument projected hope about the new direction of American society. It is now in front of the School of the Future in West Fairmount Park. Deeper in Fairmount Park is the Shofuso Japanese House and Garden. Installed in 1958 and sponsored by the Japanese government, Shofuso is a life-size Japanese mansion built in the 17th century Shoinzukuri architectural style. Taking advantage of Fairmount Park's location, Shofuso evokes the seamless balance of natural harmony and built environments that is central to the Japanese tea ceremony and continues to operate as a center for Japanese art and culture today. It's also a great place to socially distance. Despite the social preference for calming themes in public art, Philadelphia also embraced the voices of some of its newest citizens when, in 1964, it authorized the construction of one of America's first memorials to the Holocaust. The monument to 6 million Jewish martyrs, designed by Polish Jewish sculptor Nathan Rappaport, challenges viewers to make sense not only of the carnage, but of the redemptive nature of fire in the biblical story of Exodus. The standalone monument on the Benjamin Franklin Parkway was rededicated in 2018 when the Holocaust Memorial Plaza was built around it, including historical information about Nazi Germany and human rights. While the Fairmount Park Art Association has been successful in soliciting private sponsorship for monuments, Philadelphia's 1959 adoption of the Percent for Art initiative would shift the financial burden of new civic art from donors to developers. Here, we can see a self-portrait of the initiative's lead proponent, local printmaker Benton Murdoch Spruance. Requiring 1% of the budget for projects built with the Philadelphia Redevelopment Authority to go to publicly visible art, the initiative and a matching requirement by the city government has added 450 new pieces of art to Philadelphia since 1959, according to Penny Balkenbach, author of Public Art in Philadelphia. While the Redevelopment Authority found a new way to finance art, it was the 1976 bicentennial that would give new impetus for us to install it. Unlike the stately Centennial Exposition in Fairmount Park, the bicentennial would focus on bringing attention to the heavily urbanized parts of Philadelphia, like Old City. Here, we can see von Schlegel's abstract Voyage of Ulysses, installed between the new James A. Byrne Federal Courthouse and William J. Green Federal Building on Market Street. Here, we can see how the sculpture centers and defines the plaza at 76 North 6th Street, where the two buildings share an administrative entrance. Located a block to the north and west at 7th and Arch, the African American Museum in Philadelphia opened in 1976 as the first publicly funded and maintained museum dedicated to African American history. Sitting in front of the museum are two pieces unveiled at its opening. Nasaika, seen here, was sculpted by John Roden and takes a notably African form and was produced with the Sirpadu molding method native to West Africa. However, the name is derived from the word for we in the Chinukwawa language of the Pacific Northwest. Roden sought to communicate that the struggles of West Africans and Chinook natives was a shared one to protect and celebrate their cultures. Next to Nasaika is Whispering Bells, a tribute to Crispus Attucks. Attucks was a dock worker of both Native and African descent living in Boston. At the age of 47, he was shot and killed by British troops at the Boston Massacre, triggering a popular uprising that would lead into the American Revolution. The memorial features 13 bells for the original 13 states, each bell salvaged from a ship, train, or fire engine. Over in Center City, the bicentennial also gave new urgency to redesigning the area around City Hall which had fallen into disrepair. Today, one of the more recognizable features of Center City is Klaus Oldenburg's clothespin, sponsored by the Percent for Art initiative, which stands on a pedestal that connects the subway concourse at 15th Street with the street-level plaza above. Oldenburg's bold op art piece suggests a number of interpretations, from the possible number 76 hidden in the spring to a very elaborate birdhouse. According to the artist, it's just a clothespin. Moving over to the Municipal Services Building, Government of the People rises above the corner of Broad Street and John F. Kennedy. This monument was funded by the city's Percent for Art rule when the new Municipal Services Building was completed in 1963. However, when the monument was set to be cast in 1972, Philadelphia's recently elected mayor refused to pay for it, complaining that it looked like a load of dumped plaster. That mayor, of course, is Frank Rizzo, seen here in the month of his swearing in, January of 1972, meeting with President Nixon. The Association for Public Art took up the call to raise funds for this monument, and it was unveiled on time in 1976. The most iconic image of Philadelphia to come from the bicentennial is Love Park, designed by Ed Bacon, father of actor Kevin Bacon. While the park's urban layout has changed substantially since Bacon's 1976 design, its eponymous op art centerpiece, Robert Indiana's Love Statue, continues to sit at the southeast entrance on 15th and John F. Kennedy Boulevard. In 2015, Indiana accompanied Love with Amor, a monument meaning love in Latin and Spanish, to commemorate the World Meeting of Families in Philadelphia. Shortly after the bicentennial, Philadelphia celebrated its own tercentennial in 1982. On the 300th anniversary of the signing of the Treaty of Shakamakson, we returned to Penn Treaty Park to see William Penn's contemporary monument by Frank Gaylord. In this depiction, Penn holds aloft the 1701 Charter of Privileges, a blueprint for future documents like the U.S. Bill of Rights. Tucked away near 2nd and Walnut in Old City, we see Welcome Park. Designed by Venturi, Scott Brown and Associates, who also redesigned Franklin Court for the bicentennial, Welcome Park recreates the original plan of Philadelphia that Penn laid out, including a model of Milne Calder's statue atop City Hall. Here, we can see a version of William Penn's original plan for the city, itself a monument to the Enlightenment era thinking on urban planning. While these monuments to Penn remind us where Philadelphia came from, it was Sylvester Stallone's 1982 gift of Rocky that would define our course ahead, both in terms of national recognition and the difficult debate about monuments. This statue was a movie prop, fictitiously installed at the Art Museum in one of the Rocky films. After filming was complete, Stallone donated the monument to the city, triggering strong opposition from citizens concerned that the monument honored a fictional character and bears the likeness of a living person. It was in this year as well that Caroni's Columbus was moved from Fairmount Park to its current location in Marconi Plaza, and shortly after this, that the Religious Liberty statue would be placed at 5th and Market. Monumental art since the tercentennial has continued to explore the different voices and histories of Philadelphia's residents. In 1994, Chief Tamanend of the Turtle Clan was installed at the corner of Front and Market Streets. Standing atop his clan symbol at the historic foreshore of the Macarakitan, Tamanend is seen with the wampum belt, which signified the historic treaty signed at Shakamakson. A block south on Front and Chestnut stands Glenda Goodacre's 2002 Irish Memorial on Gortamor, or the Great Hunger. The monument is a combination of two scenes. Hopeful Irish immigrants arriving in Philadelphia point towards the city, while a painful scene of the Great Famine points east towards the Atlantic. Two of the most dynamic recent additions to Philadelphia's public spaces addressed the treatment of people of African descent. In 2010, the National Park Service and the city jointly commissioned a monument on the site of the president's house at 6th and Market Streets. The stone wall we can see is inscribed with the names of 9 enslaved African Americans who were transported to Philadelphia to serve George Washington. Seen on the list, Ona Judge is the subject of the recently published book, Never Caught: The Washington's Relentless Pursuit of Their Runaway Slave, Ona Judge, by historian Erica Armstrong Dunbar. On the reverse side of the wall, we can see a history of chattel slavery in Pennsylvania. The president's house attempts to shift the narrative on slavery in the United States by allowing us to listen to Washington's servants in their own words, and encourages us to consider the way Washington's personal financial interests in slavery would impact our historical trajectory on racism. One of the most recent monuments to be unveiled in Philadelphia in 2017, A Quest for Parity by Brantley Cadet, celebrates and mourns the life of one of Philadelphia's most influential abolitionists. Professor Octavius Valentine Catto was an athlete, scholar, and advocate for public transportation and accommodations protections a century before Rosa Parks' Montgomery bus boycott. Professor Catto stands here between the streetcars he fought to integrate and the ballot box for which he fought for equal access. His pose, like many of Cadet's works, is dynamic. Instead of creating a statue to blend into the background, A Quest for Parity disrupts the built environment and beckons us to interact with its painful duality. The last monument we are going to talk about today is the one that I first alluded to, the Frank Rizzo Monument. Installed in 1998, less than 100 feet from the government of the people that he fought against, Rizzo's monument portrayed him as both larger than life and eternally among the people of Philadelphia. This sympathetic treatment of Philadelphia's former police commissioner and 2-term mayor cannot hide the facts. Frank Rizzo was a self-proclaimed homophobic and racist politician. His disregard for constitutionally protected rights as police commissioner and mayor was well documented in a Philadelphia Inquirer expose, and his attempt to amend the city charter and run for a 3rd consecutive term as Philadelphia mayor was roundly rejected by voters in 1978. Even now, the fate of his statue, currently in storage, is subject to a federal lawsuit brought by his family members and supporters against the city. So that brings us back to the original question. What do Cristoforo Colombo and Francis Lazaro Rizzo Sr. have in common? In reality, not very much, but their monuments, like the monument to Rocky, epitomize the kind of trap that George Washington was concerned about back in the 1780s, the cult of personality. In his documentary on the Statue of Liberty, historian Ken Burns states that our monuments are representations of myth, not fact. As we consider what role monuments play in our culture, it's the history, not the mythology, that we must remember. Columbus, Rocky, and Rizzo are images of a specific subset of Philadelphians. And while they generate particular objections, they also raise broader questions about why white men are the subjects of so much of our public art. To that question, we need to consider how monuments end up in public at all. In the case of Philadelphia, they're considered and approved by the Philadelphia Art Commission, a public body of architects, artists, and scholars appointed by the mayor. That commission held a preliminary meeting this morning to consider the next steps for the Columbus statue in Marconi Plaza. Many monuments are proposed or funded by the Association for Public Art, the private, nonprofit organization that has been responsible for much of Fairmount Park statuary. In both cases, decisions about public art is vested in the people who have had access to artistic training and, in many cases, generational wealth. Statistically, these factors exclude many of the minority groups who have called Philadelphia home. In this moment of national reckoning, it is crucial for us to re-examine who is making decisions about monument installation. 2 weeks ago, we had the privilege to hear from Dennis Pickerel, Executive Director at Stenton, about the Inequality in Bronze project. During his talk, he laid out a framework for developing a new monument to memorialize Dinah, an enslaved African woman who was credited for saving Stenton during the Revolution. Rather than relying solely on members of historical or artistic circles to develop the monument, Stenton has engaged with the local community to create a memorial that helps Black Philadelphians connect with the history of their neighborhood. This morning, I had the pleasure to listen to a talk hosted by the Design Advocacy Group between Daniel R. Biddle and Murray Dubin, co-authors of Tasting Freedom, Octavius Catto and the Battle for Equality in Civil War America, in conversation with Patricia Wilson Aden, president of the African American Museum in Philadelphia. Their discussion centered on the Quest for Parity Monument and possible future sites to memorialize the African American experience in Philadelphia. Locations like the London Coffee House with its infamous slave auction block on Front Street, Camp William Penn, which was exclusively used for training formerly enslaved soldiers of the Civil War in Cheltenham Township, the Tinley Temple and its associations with the Great Migration, and even Girard College and its fight for integration are prime examples of future monumental subjects to the Black experience. Recent events have also called into question the roles of cities and states in removing monuments. While the Rizzo Monument removal generated a lot of attention, it is certainly not the first city-owned monument to disappear from public view. When the city began to redesign the International Sculpture Garden at Penn's Landing to make way for the Spruce Street Harbor Park, 2 indigenous monuments from Costa Rica and the Pacific Northwest, and a 16th and 17th century monument from India and Korea were quietly moved into storage with no reinstallation date announced. Further, almost all material referencing King George III was stripped from Philadelphia following the Revolutionary War. Times of tumult often coincide with monuments being removed, but here it is important for me to make 2 distinctions. The first is that Frank Rizzo and Christopher Columbus's statues were not removed because protesters in Philadelphia demanded police reform. These statues have been subject to petitions for removal for decades, and Philadelphia's current mayor, Jim Kenney, campaigned on a platform of taking Rizzo down. The second is that removing these statues does not address protesters' demands for racial justice. While Columbus and Rizzo may symbolize past violence against people of color, racial justice cannot proceed until the systems that support and defend their actions are addressed. This happens through education, dialogue, and the dismantling of colonialist mentalities, not metal and stone figures. So ultimately, why does it matter? What is to be gained by seeing Columbus or Rizzo or hundreds of other figures around the world being removed from public view fall? Going back to Ken Burns, this process is about separating mythology from history. In the case of Washington, that means making room for the people who knew him best, his enslaved servants, to tell their side of the story. In the case of Cyrus Dallin, this process is about showing Native people as they lived, not as we like to imagine them. And for the Lenape, who are actively seeking to reclaim their lands in this area, it's about critically reevaluating our relationship with Lenapehoking as it existed for thousands of years before we arrived. As citizens of Philadelphia, we have a right to expect that monuments reflect us and contribute to a welcoming environment for visitors and new residents alike. As Penny Balkenbach so eloquently put it, the public art we have in Philadelphia really punctuates the environment, makes us look and think, and describes the outdoor setting. I think we're very fortunate. It gives people a lot to think about and a lot to like. Thank you.